Now, to those of you who may be less familiar with the Academy's Forum, it was established in 2003 and serves to catalyse connections between industry, academia and the healthcare sector, as well as regulators. And I'm pleased to say we've recently rebooted it and have been hosting a series of exciting workshops reflecting topics of interest to that broad constituency. The last, for example, was on medicine's adherence, a very critical issue. Through this forum, the Academy seeks to promote more rapid and sustainable translation of research outputs into health and wealth, a vibrant life sciences ecosystem, and a strong UK life science industry, all of which I suspect could summarise the remit of our 2015 Forum Annual Lecturer, George Freeman MP, Minister for Life Sciences. Now, George has perhaps the unusual feature as a minister of having a great deal of first-hand knowledge of his brief. Elected MP in 2010 after a 15-year career across the life sciences sector, working in hospitals with scientists, patient groups and industry to pioneer novel healthcare innovations. So it's tremendous to have you here, George. 8 months ago, he was appointed as the first Minister for Life Sciences and importantly, a Parliamentary Under Secretary of State at both BIS and DH. George, we applaud the energy, commitment and enthusiasm and first-hand knowledge you brought to this role and look forward to your lecture. Thank you.
John, thank you. It's lovely to be here. I'm sorry I was a few minutes late, and I'm sorry I can't stay right through to what won't be a bitter end. It'll be a sweet end, I know. I feel a bit of a fraud stood here. I mean, there's looking at the faces in the room, there's not much that this group can't really solve. I'm not sure you really need a Minister for Life Sciences. I look around the room and the expertise and the combined experiences, a lot of it's here. So what I'd like to do, you've given me a real privilege, this opportunity. I wanted to say something about the Academy, because when I did my homework for this, I thought I was going to find that the Academy of Medical Science was founded in 1688 and has been pioneering in thought leadership for 200 years. And it's just an absolute credit to you as an organisation and to the leadership of it, John, yourself, and John, your predecessors and others, that it's made such an impact in such a short period of time. And it is a real privilege, it's a real honour to be invited to this slot. I'm very conscious that at least half the people in this room have heard me speak at least 3 times, if not some of you, poor things, probably 30 times. This is my 32nd keynote speech since I was appointed. One of the things the Prime Minister asked me to do was get out and tell the story of what the UK life science sector can do, is doing, has done and could do in the years ahead. And I hope at least I've passed that test. I wanted to use this afternoon, not to spend too long on that, although I do want to highlight some of the things I think we've done and the legacy, but really to look ahead and flag 3 questions, challenges that I think we ought to be thinking about. And this Academy, given its very strong role in leading this debate, wouldn't be doing itself justice to if we didn't use the august panel that we're going to have in a moment to discuss. And I just want to take this opportunity to thank John and Chris and John Jeans for their work as government life science champions. I can absolutely tell you that a lot of what we've managed to do as a coalition government in the last 4 3/4 years has been in no small part due to their support and influence and work behind the scenes. People assume when you are given the privilege of ministerial office that everything just falls into your lap. Levers marked clearly can be pulled and money flows and decisions are made, and you all know that it's not like that. Actually, influence is wielded in all sorts of ways, and the champions have played a really key role, and I hope will will go on to do. Supported ably by this group, both formally and informally. So it is a real pleasure, and I'm absolutely thrilled that we've managed to unlock some funding, additional funding for the Academy in order to support that leadership, not just through the Newton Fellowships, which is important, really important work, but also through your core work streams to support the policy-making landscape. It's only £470,000, which in the great scheme of the overall government budget is not very much, but I suspect it'll be the best £470,000 we've spent in terms of impact. And I particularly wanted to welcome the work streams that you've set out, looking at the global health challenges. I'll touch on that as well. We are in both a global race for investment and for impact and influence, but we're also in a global healthcare economy, and we're in a global community afflicted by the same diseases, and the Ebola crisis this year, emergency, reminded us of that we are in epidemiology as much as in economics, all in it together. So I think that global theme is really important, as is the more domestic issue of the health burdens that challenge our health economy and our population, and crucially the meat in the sandwich, as it were, innovation and how we unlock the power of our NHS to drive innovation. So genuinely, it's a pleasure to be here, and I think the work you're doing is really important, and I look forward to supporting it in every way I can. I should say, since I was appointed, I think this is the 4th time I've been here, which is really a tribute to the quality of the events you've been putting on and the thinking that you're doing. I wanted just to say something for those of you who haven't heard me say this, a little bit about the prejudices that I brought to this job, for we all bring prejudices. I've learned that in appointing people, it's most important just to work out that you know what they are and pick people with the right experiences and prejudices to bring to jobs. So let me disclose mine really clearly. I wanted to explain what I learnt in the career before coming to this role. Something about what this role is. I'm the UK's first Minister for Life Sciences, which is a real privilege. I desperately don't want to be the UK's last Minister for Life Sciences, and I desperately don't enjoy being the world's only Minister for Life Sciences. I would be the biggest supporter of an international conference of life science ministers, but it would, I'm afraid, be chaired, convened, spoken to, wrapped up, and minuted by me at the moment. And I hope that I can convince you in the next half an hour that the challenges that I've been tasked with helping us to coordinate our response to are challenges that every advanced Western economy, and indeed some of those who are rapidly advancing to Western lifestyles and economic status, really can't seriously contemplate without being without. And some of you will have heard me say I very much hope that all the mainstream parties in Parliament, with a serious vision for the future of this country, from which list I would exclude UKIP and the SNP, all of the mainstream parties would have a shadow Minister for Life Sciences, because I think it goes right to the heart of how we grapple with the challenges that we face as a society. So let me just say something about the role, and then what I've learnt and in the career before, and then something about what we're trying to do, and then the thoughts on where we go. The role, crucially, and John I think has highlighted it, is not just a Minister at Department of Business, where we've traditionally supported the life science sector in government, but crucially a Minister in the Department of Health as well. And I just want to take a moment to highlight the excellent work that's been done over the last 20 years. Those of you who know me know I go out of my way to do this in a non-partisan way for 2 reasons. Partly because this sector needs long-term policy continuity, which doesn't fit neatly into the Punch and Judy cycles of traditional politics. And partly because actually a lot of the work on this has been done by luminaries such as David Sainsbury and Paul Drayson and Lord Mandelson. I'm extremely proud of what we've done as a government. I think David Willits deserves a huge amount of credit for his work, and it's just an honour to take my part in that evolving line, and I've no doubt that over the next 20, 30 years there'll be all sorts of other people who have the privilege of taking the baton. I think this agenda needs to be conducted in that long-term way. There'll be differences, of course, and the policies will have to be developed within the framework of particular elected government's priorities. But I think this agenda merits, deserves, and has earned, frankly, through its own ability to make its case, a very strong cross-party support. And I'm delighted that the review, that I'll say something about in a minute, has got the support of both the Labour and the Liberal Democrat parties in Parliament, which I've also secured in writing. Crucially, the appointment of the Minister of Life Science led very much by the Prime Minister, and I just want to highlight that he has a very personal as well as a strategic governmental commitment to this. Through his own family, he's seen the importance of genomics, the importance of medical research, and the power of and the excellence of that community. But as a Prime Minister of a government trying to grow our way out of a really strategic economic mess, a massive debt legacy, a structural deficit in the public finances, he is, as is the Chancellor, well seized of the importance of this sector, both really to help us do two key things: to help diffuse the structural deficit in health, which is still driving deficits at the heart of the public finances, and to attract the significant investment that we need to get into this country to grow the jobs and the businesses and the technologies of tomorrow and generate the prosperity that we need to pay for healthcare. We've traditionally tried to support life sciences from Department of Business, I think very successfully in lots of ways. My message to the Prime Minister at the beginning of the Parliament was, look, the life sciences sector is changing from a 20th century model to a 21st century model, and we can't rely on our leadership in the 20th century, wonderful though it is, to secure us world-class status in the 21st. So that deep science excellence, the Nobel Prize winning excellence, the extraordinary scientific expertise that we have in the UK, and that deep pharmaceutical and smaller company footprint are both key. But in the new landscape, we're going to have to integrate our health system with our research cluster. Not just because we need the tissues, the data, the clinical insights, the access to that clinical infrastructure at the heart of the NHS, but we also need the health system to be pulling innovation through more quickly, getting it into patients more quickly, testing better, and adopting. And my argument was that we won't survive as a 21st century powerhouse in medical life science without that integration. And indeed, that integration offers this country its greatest opportunity to solve that core strategic challenge, which is how do we get more health out of every pound we spend, and do so in a way that makes the UK a world-class destination for inward investment and jobs and prosperity to generate the wealth we need to pay for the health. I should just say that that challenge is not uniquely facing this country, but it's one that all advanced ageing Western societies will face, but we face it particularly acutely. I think it bears repetition. We're carrying still £1 trillion of debt from the crash. We've got the economy growing again, Britain growing at 2.67%, France 0, Germany 0.67. It's a good achievement. But the structural deficit is that bit of the deficit that continues to grow when the economy's growing. I call it a bonfire in the basement of the public finances. As our economy grows, 4 things are contributing to a structural deficit: healthcare, pensions, welfare, public sector pensions, welfare, and debt interest. Now, we've put in place some important reforms to try and level off the scale of that growth on welfare and on public sector pensions. Debt interest, we're in the hands of the capital markets, confidence in our economic management. Healthcare is driven, as you know better than anyone, by an ageing society, the epidemiology of Western societies, and that is not something that any government can easily pull a lever and prevent. This spring, as we go into the end of this Parliament, we have 1 million more pensioners than we had in spring 2010. That's 1 million more people with all the things that pensioners need. They're going to, not all of them, they're going to need more hips, joints, they're going to need new drugs, they're going to be presenting at A&E and GP clinics. That's 1 million more people generating the very highest demand on our system. And we have a system which, a 20th century model of healthcare, in which we tend to diagnose relatively late, generally, we treat in hospitals, and we've been funding in silos through primary and secondary and community care. So we have a problem in that our system is not well geared up to face this ever-growing, rising population-based pressure, which comes from the, let's not forget, from the extraordinary advances that this community, that biomedical research and the life science sector has made. They're so incremental, and to those of us who are, all of us here, working in the sector, ground down every day by the petty frustrations and the delays, we sometimes forget, I think, the extraordinary advances that this society has made in the last 30, 40, 50 years. Even in my lifetime as a child, I remember cancer was a word to be absolutely dreaded. It meant more than likely, as far as I could tell, certain death. And parents would dread the word. Now, of course, it's a terrible disease still, but some cancers becoming very treatable, some even preventable, and extraordinary breakthroughs in life expectancy and in our understanding of disease and our ability to treat. So it is a fabulous achievement, and it's given millions of people life expectancy and quality of life expectations that their parents couldn't have dreamt of. I think in the great story of human endeavour, we'll look back on this period and say you had to be there at a time when bioscience, biomedicine was really changing expectations that people had lived with, an expectation of disease, and changing our ability to live longer and healthier and happier lives. But it creates pressure on the system to which we now have to respond. Let me just say something about those prejudices that I brought as I arrived in Parliament, a rather hairier and thinner person 4 3/4 years ago. I'd had a career, John was kind enough to mention 15 years, so in 3 phases really. 4.5 years in venture capital, starting biomedical startups. 4 years running one, and then 7 years working with university, NHS, hospital and industry partnerships, setting up translational research institutes. And there were 3 big lessons really. As a venture capitalist, I learnt 2 key things. The first was the difference between value and cash. If you've got real value, i.e. something that can change the course of a disease, really improve patient outcomes, reduce healthcare costs, then it doesn't matter if you haven't got cash, you'll be able to raise cash. If you've got something that's of real value, cash will follow. If you've got lots of cash and nothing of any real value, you really are not in play, and you won't find you're able to really make a difference. It's about value, and I think the same is true in our healthcare system. The real focus should be on value, and value in a healthcare system is about preventing disease, about promoting health, and about finding those things that help us deliver more health from each pound. The second lesson I learnt, which was incredibly depressing, having a 10-year fund and £40 million, feeling like we could change the earth, was if anyone came to me and said, we have a brilliant innovation that'll save hundreds of millions of pounds in the National Health Service, all we need is a bit of funding to get it to proof of concept and then we'll sell it into the NHS, I would quietly close the folder and say, I'm so sorry, we only have 10 years of money. We haven't possibly got enough time to fund you through into the NHS. If that's your sales channel, you'll have to go elsewhere. Well, how sad is that? And that fundamental truth sort of scarred me and stays with me today, now on the other side of the fence as a minister in the Department of Health. I then was lucky enough to go off and run a startup. We were doing toxicology prediction software and novel chemistry. I learned something. Trying to run a company doing one thing, not two. You tend to do one thing really well, not two. We did the toxicology prediction software really well, and I learned something very powerful. If you put a big computer, some clever people and some really clever algorithms at a database, insights can be generated very fast, which change the way you may have gone about doing what you would have done before. And I saw our ability to look at a compound, work out where it would be toxicological, no animal tests needed, no human tests, no phase 1, 2s. You just predict with a computer, this is going to be toxicological in the liver, it's going to be tox here. And we could predict exactly which bit of the compound would make it toxic, and then tweak the chemistry, take it off, repatent it. Huge value to the R&D pipeline, cutting out hugely expensive and frankly difficult things that we'd rather not do. We all want to minimize the level of unnecessary testing in animals and in people. So I discovered the power of informatics and data to really open up new insights, both into new diagnostics and cures, but also just rapid advances in our understanding of today's pharmacopoeia and how we could use it. We were a little company working on 3 or 4 therapeutic areas, And I dreamt at the time, imagine if you could really throw a really big computer at the really big pharmacopoeia with really big clinical records, what you might start to uncover and unlock by way of possibilities. So at the beginning of this Parliament, when the government rightly set out life sciences as an absolutely key area for our economic growth, Pfizer announced they were closing their R&D plant in Sandwich, and it sent a bit of a tremor through policymakers, having just identified this key sector as an absolute banker for growth. The first bit of news the sector gave us was a sudden closure. And I managed to get a conversation with the Prime Minister and the Chancellor to say, no, this is absolutely what we would have expected. Anyone in the industry has known it's been coming for years. This is a 1940s plant. It was put there for all sorts of reasons to do with the war, and we shouldn't worry about that. We should absolutely worry about investing in Sandwich and making sure we turn it into a bioincubator, and let's support the local task force and do everything we can. But this is a symptom of a change. The landscape is changing. 20th century to 21st. We're going to see an evolution from a very siloed model of deep science, spin-outs if you're lucky, venture capital if you're lucky, acquisition by pharma if you're lucky, phase 1, 2, 3, 4, regulatory clearance, NICE approval, NHS, and the all-too-patient waiting at the end for an innovation. Increasingly taken 10 years, 15 years, over $1 billion in drugs to bring back to something that can be shown to be safe and efficacious in everybody, to a world where actually unlocking the power of genomics and data, we could start to predict much earlier which patients will respond to the drug. We could start to take risk and time and cost out of the R&D pipeline and allow us to get the right drugs to the right patients more quickly, to win-win. And actually what we should do is set out a strategy for how we help industry adapt to the extraordinary challenges of that landscape, new models of reimbursement, new models of regulation, new models of drug discovery, put in place a landscape that supports their evolution, and do everything we can on our side of the fence to build a policy landscape that is genuinely supportive of healthcare innovation, and to set out a strategy for that also reflected our unique strengths in the global race for investment. And all of us in this room know that integrated healthcare system that we have in the NHS, the proprietary data, integrated data advantages, they're not seamless, perfect, clean, or necessarily right now fit for every purpose that we'd like to put them to, but they are nonetheless there as a potential that data advantage and our ethical and regulatory strengths and reputation, and those values of the NHS which resonate around the world. We have a healthcare system that people respect, that those give us a really unique advantage to unlock this translational model of research, and that we should put it to work. And of course, the reason this sector has been so effective is that I wasn't the only person saying it. The Academy was saying it. The Prime Minister's Science and Technology Advisory Council was saying it. The people who carry influence in the corridors of power were all saying the same thing. It was a really important lesson, I think, for other industries. If you want to get taken seriously, get your leaders together, agree on what you agree on, and communicate it very clearly to the heart of government. And it's extraordinary what you can achieve. And so thus was born the life science strategy, and it was a great pleasure to be able to be involved closely in it and pulling it together. And those of you who haven't read the Prime Minister's speech of December 11, I commend it to you, and I'll happily email you a copy. In it, he said various important things, but one of them was, let me be clear, my vision is this: every NHS patient, a research patient, every NHS hospital, a research institution. The idea being we must use that footprint of healthcare across the NHS to drive research. And of course, interestingly, when you go back and look at the founding charter of the NHS, as I did, you discover that it was always there. The research was always a key part of the original vision of the NHS. Let's use the collective resources of our health system to prevent disease for tomorrow. And developing the cross-party riff, I want to suggest to you that if Nye Bevan was here today, he would be no more fierce a proponent of genomics and data than any of us. He would be absolutely insistent that we unlock those collective assets at the heart of the system for the mutual benefit of us all. So the strategy was set out, and various good things have been done, I think, at BIS and actually at DH, through particularly opening up some of the data, CPRD, the NIHR work, building the clinical research infrastructure, the progress on getting patients into trials more quickly. First-in-man trial numbers are up this year. The numbers of patients in commercial trials are up. Investment in trials are up. The big challenge, I think, is really that pull-through, that innovation adoption bit, the second cylinder. I think we're pushing in some of the clinical resource. It's the pull-through that I'm particularly focused on. And the Prime Minister's instruction to me on reshuffle day was go over the road to the Department of Health, link our health system to our life science strategy for the benefit of patients, create a landscape in which we can really adopt the innovation, the genius, the creativity, the science, the technology of our life science sector at the heart of our health system, so that we deliver more health for each pound, precision medicine, smart medicine, 21st century healthcare in a way that attracts that investment into the UK. Now, there are lots of challenges to really delivering that. I don't think it's a 8-9 month achievement. It's not even a 5-year achievement. I think it's at least a 10-year achievement. So this is a start. I wanted just to say something about what we've tried to do in this first 9 months and then where we go from here. First thing is, as well as the appointment of the Minister, this directorate in the Department of Health, the Director of Innovation, Technology and Growth, headed up by Will Cavendish, is a deep structural commitment at the heart of DH to this agenda. Don't underestimate the power of that. Ministers come and go, but officials stay. And at the heart of the DH is now a structural governance commitment right in the guts of the machine to driving innovation, technology and growth, and to developing a new conversation with the Treasury about the Department of Health as a growth department, not just a spending department. And that is very important, that over the road the Treasury looms above my office window and they look out of the window and see a department that swallows money like nothing on earth. And what we need to convince them is that that money is going, of course, for a good cause, which is healthcare, but it's not just a liability on the public balance sheet, it's an asset, and that we're investing in a whole series of assets that will drive growth and attract investment and generate the prosperity that we need to pay for that healthcare. And that directorate in the DH are leading that conversation and turning around some of the thinking about 21st century health economics. And crucially, the Office of Life Sciences, which we've invested in and developed, Nicole Mather come in from the private sector to run it, now meets. The delivery board meets fortnightly in my office in BIS and DH. We alternate. It's a department-blind, strategy-focused leadership unit involving private and public sector people to really drive the implementation of the strategy. The two key things that I've tried to focus on are unashamedly NHS Focus, which is what you asked me to talk about this afternoon. The first is this review of accelerated access, and the second, the Testbeds for taking innovation to proof of concept at scale in population-based health system in the NHS. Let me just say something about both of them. The first initiative is really asking a question. Is there something we could do in the UK to look at what the FDA have done in the US in terms of fast-tracking and breakthrough designations? 43% of latest NCE approvals through the FDA have come through fast-tracking. Is there something we could do in the UK that would be similarly catalytic? Could we take our NIHR £1 billion a year infrastructure at the heart of the NHS, develop an early access scheme so it's very easy to go through from research into first patients in a new sort of research medicine context, heavily monitored, patient consent, clinical approval, measuring, capturing the data, and then where innovations, device or drug, works well in a particular cohort, we could link through to specialist commissioning and get innovations pulled through. And then could we be intelligent and use the data to price more creatively, to reimburse on the basis of real impact, real value? And could we do this in a way that would make Britain really the best place in the world to come and get innovative drugs or devices tested and proven? I learned in those early years that the most valuable thing for an emerging company isn't price, actually. It's two things. It's clinical proof of concept that your innovation works in real patients with real disease, living real lives, not in clean mice, but in people who have comorbidities, who have lives, who take other pills, who live the way that people with disease live. And the second thing is, can you get your innovation adopted at scale? And those two key things, I think, are more important than price. I'm not suggesting that price is unimportant at all, and particularly for the public companies whose value is driven rather more on their ability to sell and generate revenues, then their price sensitivity is a real issue. But so is cost, and so is time, and so is predictability, and so is the ability to be sure that their pipeline is likely to come to fruition. So whichever way you cut it, I think this opportunity of quicker access into clinical proof of concept is absolutely key, and it plays to our unique strengths. There is no health system in the world that's got our genomic and informatic assets, our deep science, our clinical research infrastructure across an integrated health system with all the reputation that it carries with it. It's genuinely an external review. It's not a review. The answer is not sitting on my shelf waiting to be published. I don't think anyone in the Department of Health or the Office of Life Sciences has got all the answers for a minute. So we're genuinely structuring it so that the key stakeholders on the public side of the fence, NICE, MHRA, NHS England, OLS, are all locked into it and committed and part of it. But crucially, an advisory board of the best people we can find out in the sector, from private, small, medium, large, from charities, patient groups. We want to get the best people in, and a number of work streams looking across that landscape. And my challenge and test is really clear. Don't write me a 150-page report on how good we are. Set out some really clear recommendations for how we can move the dial and get innovations coming to this country at a higher rate and in a way that attracts the investment into this country that we need, and in a way that gives patients the confidence that if you're an NHS patient, you're more likely to be getting the very latest treatment at the heart of our system, and tackles the great reimbursement challenge and opportunity of using data and measurement to support a smarter 21st century model of reimbursement. NICE and MHRA are very, very up for these challenges. They're already thinking about how technology is changing the landscape in which they work. And I think there's an opportunity for us to really allow all of our agencies to really step up to the plate and show the leadership required to really entrench our position in this new landscape. The second initiative is about tackling within the NHS the traditional problem we've had of great innovations taken through the academic health science centres, or even smaller biomedical research centres, or even some of our general hospitals. But they never go beyond the place that they were originally invented, for a whole series of reasons to do with siloed budgeting, tariff distortion, cultural barriers, obstacles, bureaucracy, lack of empowerment, a whole series of issues across the fourth largest organisation in the world. It's hardly surprising that it has barriers to easy implementation of innovation. But Simon Stevens and his team set out in the 5-year forward view a very, very important idea that we might be able to use places in our NHS as test beds for innovation. Take our great cities, Manchester, Liverpool, Leeds, Newcastle, London, Birmingham. Populations of 2 to 3 million, places where you haven't got 20 chief executives of hospitals to agree to something, but 1 or 2, 3. You've got a manageable group of leaders who could get together and really make it work, and we could drive integration between primary, secondary and community care, develop test beds for really integrated health cost tracking, health disease tracking, and therefore innovation measurement. And so we're going to be looking at whether we could use these NHS test beds as places to take an innovation through to scale. Then we have the democratic moment in May, and who knows what will happen. But I hope that whichever coalition arrives in government on May the 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th, for we are all coalitions of one sort or another, will inherit these initiatives, will respect the thinking behind them and the cross-party support for them and take them forward. I wanted just to really close with these 3 thoughts, perhaps for the panel for us to think about challenges and opportunities in the next phase as we look ahead. The first is patient support. Because it seems to me part of what's going on in this shift from 20th to 21st century healthcare is a very profound shift from healthcare being something essentially done to patients, a passive patient who waits and is diagnosed and treated by the system when the system judges it appropriate, to a model in which we empower 21st century healthcare citizens to take more interest, responsibility, to give them the data and the information, to be more aware of their lifestyle choices and the impact they have, not to punish, but to empower and to help people to be aware. We all know, you all know better than me, that the minute a family, a loved one, an individual gets a diagnosis, they become really, really interested in information and in research. And I think there's something rather exciting in this. I don't mean that on day one everybody in the country must become a first adapter, a health zealot at all, but that we need to open up this revolution and empower and encourage people to take more responsibility, because in the end, that passive model, the system won't be able to cope with the consequences of it. So it's really important that these initiatives have patient support. If we're going to really open up accelerated early access to innovative treatments, the patients really need to be excited about it, need to support it, need to be on board, they need to have a voice in this review. And I think one of the very important groups who speak for the patients, obviously doctors, but I think also the research charities have a really important role to play here. And the landscape, as I look at it, I'm struck that few organisations are more fired up by the need to tackle disease, more fired up by the need to give patients voice, more fired up by the realities of living with disease from cradle to grave across the whole population, and more passionate about the technology convergence and the need to combine a vision of early diagnosis, prevention, treatment, and a broader view of the costs of disease than the charities. And I really think the medical research charities, small and large, have got a bigger voice to play in the heart of this landscape, and I hope in this review. But if we leave the patients behind on genomics, on data, on early access, then I think we'll not be able to deliver the opportunity. I don't think there's any reason to be pessimistic about that. By the way, I can assure you the people who are most passionately banging on my door wanting early access and innovation are patients. No more so than the mothers of the children with dystrophy who want innovative drugs into the system. Now, they accept that at the moment the cost of that is vast, and my challenge is to try and reduce that cost and find ways that we can get innovative drugs in more quickly. And I think the best way to do that is to become more of a partner and use our extraordinary assets in the health system to de-risk and reduce the cost of that development. The second opportunity I wanted to throw out there is reimbursement. I just think there's a very quiet revolution in reimbursement that this whole translational model of research begins to unlock. I didn't see it at first. I saw the benefits of translational medicine, academic, clinical and industry partners working together around patients and patient resources, more in terms of the research, the power of the data and the tissues and the genomics. But increasingly, actually, I think there's a real opportunity on reimbursement. Once we can start to put our resources to work as a partner in the development of innovations, we start to unlock a new opportunity. And when I talk to the emerging companies particularly, they are more than up for a new partnership with us. If you can help us develop innovative treatments, help us get them to proof of concept, help us get them proven at scale, of course we're going to want to show that we're going to get reimbursed, and we're going to want you to help us set a health economic gold kite mark validation that we can use to sell our product around the world. But it also means we're prepared to be flexible on pricing, and I think there's an opportunity for the UK, huge opportunity for us in there. And the third thing is to do with incentivizing non-siloed behaviour. I'm very struck that we've created a healthcare and in some ways a life science economy in the 20th century, which is very siloed. Now, sometimes incredibly powerfully so. You go to the Laboratory of Molecular Biology. It's a silo, but boy, is it a good silo. I mean, it's a world-class silo, and I wouldn't want to de-silo it. So the silos have a really important value, but I'm very struck that in medicine, not that I'm a qualified medic, but I just make this observation, when you look at the history of medical science, so often it's the observational, the accidental, the interactional that drives the insights. Have you noticed that your patients, that stuff can be just as important as the grant application research project? And so many of the discoveries, the breakthroughs, the insights aren't things that could be predicted. And the power of technology convergence in this new field, mathematics and algorithms and computer science and data and informatics and imaging, combined with cell biology and nanotechnology and microfluidics, and there's something very powerful in this convergence. And in terms of healthcare delivery, we need to get primary and secondary and community care people talking to each other about how we could reduce the cost burden of disease across the population. But we don't incentivize that behavior very well. I'll leave you just with this. As a constituency MP, I'm very struck that my constituency is a rural backwater. It won't be by the time I'm finished with it, I can assure you, but it has traditionally been treated as a rural backwater. It's the most isolated bit of the most isolated county that only last month was connected to the National Trunk Road system with a dual carriageway. It's 40 miles from Cambridge. On a global map from Shanghai, Singapore, San Diego, you would assume it's part of a world-class biomedical innovation research cluster. I can assure you it does not feel like it. And one of the real challenges, I think, for this sector is to make sure that the innovation we do in those extraordinary silos begins much more quickly to change healthcare outcomes across the population. That was why we set up the AHSNs, and one of the things this review needs to look at is how we can get that interaction, those two cylinders pumping in a local way more effectively. But my point really was this: when I go back as a constituency MP, I'm lobbied by people perfectly rationally. They're lobbying for their silo. We funded in silos, so we shouldn't be surprised in government if you get siloed behaviour. So I asked myself, imagine if we incentivised a different behaviour. Imagine if we incentivised people to think across the silos and think about the health population. Here's a really radical thought. It's not government policy. Imagine if you took in a county like Norfolk, everything we spend on health and care, and the health and care bits of welfare, and put it all in a pot. I've added it up. I don't think anyone else has, because there's no reason you ever would, because no one's responsible for it. But it's about 3 billion. And it's 850,000 people, 5 small cities and a rural population. I think that's quite a lot of money. And I think if you said to the people of Norfolk, by the way, we're projecting inflation over the next 5 years, a dotted line, which is what the Treasury lies awake at night about. Could you take that money and spend it better to prevent more disease, prevent late, expensive hospitalised treatment, diagnose earlier, treat better? Could you, do you think, reduce that rate of inflation? I think the answer is yes. I think if we incentivise that behaviour, the best incentive I could think of would be to say, how about we split the difference? We'll take half of it back to pay off the debt, and you can have the other half to reinvest in tomorrow's healthcare. I think we'd unlock extraordinary leadership that is at the moment lost in the system or expressed in little beacons of hope that the healthcare economy is characterised by. Brilliant people doing extraordinary things, but a system that isn't very good at taking them to scale. And I think a lot of that is about incentivising the behaviours. It's not about money in my experience, and the work I did with the academic health science centres, actually what I saw is the money flows from unlocking the leadership of inspired clinical scientists who really want to make a difference to their patients using their science. So 3 thoughts for you: something about patient support, something about reimbursement, and something about incentives to encourage people to think beyond the silos that we traditionally fund in. I don't pretend it's easy, but I do think it's very exciting. I also think it's very, very important. So I'm absolutely delighted to be here. I'm privileged to be in this role, and I really look forward to working with you this year and hopefully beyond. Thanks.
George, thank you so much for a splendid forum lecture. I'm going to invite our 3 life science champions they tell me they've met before, but never in a public arena such as this. But they form our expert panel. The Minister has to leave around 4:10, 4:15. So what I suggest we do is initially rise to the three issues that you've articulated at the end there, George, and start, I think, importantly with the patient pull factor, because it seems to me, and I think to the Academy of Medical Sciences, that we could engineer a better innovation system, the structures, the projection of the science, the regulatory environment. But unless we attend to society's appetite for that, you could get a perfect system which wouldn't land effectively. And in that discussion, we have to distinguish between, as you rightly say, patients who are, of course, greater risk takers from the bulk who are at that time not patients, the citizen, who tend to be perhaps more risk averse and concerned about some of the implications of modern science. And I wonder if firstly you or the panel had a view on that. John, could I start with you?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that it seems to me that that's a really key issue, and George did touch on that. If you put that in context, I think one of the interesting things that's happened in medical research, and one of the reasons why, if you look across the academic disciplines in the UK, the one that had the biggest uplift in the REF in terms of impacts and outputs was the biomedical arena. And I think that goes to the fact that there has been remarkable alignment over at least a decade between a whole range of different funders, public, private sector funders, between the research community and the academic community, the NHS and clinical scientists and clinicians working in the NHS, and indeed industry. And I think all those agencies are pulling in the same direction, and I think that's given this hugely buoyant impact on what we all do. And because of that, it's brought more money into the space, the money's used more effectively, the outputs go up, and it's all terrific. The bit of that system, though, which doesn't get talked about, is what it's all for, and that's the patients at the far end. We kind of take it all for granted that they like it all, and and I suspect they probably do like it all. But anyway, the truth is, I don't think we've ever asked them properly, and I think we need to think about how we engage that, because it's a vulnerability for us, I think. And you do see it when the care.data thing went south. Had the patients been properly aligned with that discussion, there would have been no debate. The Daily Mail couldn't have said anything, because the patients would have said, this is all terrific. But it was very noticeable. There was no patient on Radio 4. There was no vocal patient that said, actually, this is really what we want. So I totally endorse that concept, John.
John.
Yeah, I think both point one and point three are kind of linked together. One is getting patient support, and the other one is breaking down silos, because I don't look at it as a patient issue. It's actually an individual issue. It's a citizen's issue, and actually wider than that, it's the family, it's the work colleagues. It's bigger than that. Interestingly, in your last forum, one of the summary points was, actually went to this, the forum lectures reasserted the centrality of patients and citizens to decision-making in healthcare. That's what you said a year ago. And I think that amplifies very well the sort of discussion we're having now. To me, the biggest single force that could change this asymmetrical relationship between healthcare providers and individuals is the power of information, is the power of the internet. Because we're seeing it happening now. Medical practitioners may not like it, but the reality is that most people are using the internet today to support their health and well-being. And they're doing it in an uncontrolled, sometimes probably very ignorant way, but they are. And unless the healthcare professionals, and particularly primary physicians, primary level physicians, general practitioners, understand that, the system will change, and perhaps not in the way that we want it to. So to me, the part of the issue here is how we can influence that and go along with that change, because that's going to be profound.
Indeed. Chris, any comments? Or
Well, two quick ones. Number one, George, fantastic. Great speech. You nailed it. But I say that in all seriousness because I think you have described some of the opportunities and challenges facing us, and I think you've done that exceptionally well. On the patient, I guess my only add and build would be to say, building on the internet point, in the review, let's make sure we get some folk in who are younger. I don't want to be rude or ageist, but the truth is that the revolution of the internet and social media is changing everybody's behaviour, and it would be hugely disappointing if we ignored that. And I don't want to be disrespectful to the NHS, but I don't think the NHS is the best exponent of using some of this new technology. So I would add that little piece in for your consideration.
I think that's very wise. I mean, the transactional relationship that younger people anticipate with the health service is going to be very different from older people. Can we move to the second issue, reimbursement? And clearly this is a complex and somewhat politically fraught issue. But in terms of incentivising the system in which tariff can play a very critical role, I think government is avowed that it doesn't want to restructure, but it seems difficult to me without some form of financial restructuring that you can achieve the goal that you wish to achieve. And with that financial restructuring comes a larger restructuring concept. It's all right having innovation and accelerators, but eventually if you want to scale that, you're going to have to think about the overall contractual relationships and structural relationships of the health service. John?
Yeah, I think that certainly talking about the medical device and diagnostic sector for a moment, the drumbeat there has been adoption in the NHS and the reasons why adoption by the NHS is troublesome. And many companies founded and developed in the UK take their devices and diagnostics overseas first to launch them. And historically there's been a root cause determined for that, which is cultural, whatever that means, within the NHS. There's a pushback on new idea, not in innovation actually, but more in adoption. The current drumbeat is different. The current drumbeat in NHS England anyway is tariff. That's what you hear. And there are many companies who've claim to have played the game, if you like, going through nice appraisal, through all the adoption processes that are available to it, and getting support through healthcare technology assessments, and then find themselves being given a tariff barrier, which can take up to 3 or 4 years to be removed or changed. And there's a discussion about how that could be done on a local basis, but it appears that that's quite difficult as well. So right now, that appears to be a serious issue. So if partnership, and George mentioned partnership, and I think it's a very important word, partnership with industrial companies is being proposed, they've got to have some reassurance that if they go through a partnership model, there will be a positive outcome. Because at the moment, the sense certainly in those sectors is they have gone along with the partnership concept, but it hasn't paid off yet. So I think partnership would be great if there was a more guaranteed result from that partnership.
Indeed. Other comments from our panel? John?
Well, it seems to me that there are a number of things that you can maneuver in this space. And in fact, it was David Cookseys in his original report in 2006 who said, we're looking at a system for developing and regulating new medicines, which is really not appropriate for the modern world. And, that was absolutely right. But, we're sitting here almost 10 years later, and the truth is we're still doing it exactly the same way as we were doing it in 2006. So I think one needs to think a little bit more creatively about how we can balance off a number of different ways to take some of the expense, which is dramatic, out of the development of drugs, get patients access to drugs faster, which I think all of us believe is a really important component, and to, in some ways, potentially share the risk that's associated, the very substantial risk, I have to say, which comes with developing drugs. And so this, for example, this interesting balance between the pace of adoption and the price. I suspect most pharmaceutical industry representatives would say that actually the speed of adoption is as big a driver as the ultimate price, because it gives, if you do the calculation, it gives you extra years at peak sales. If you can adopt 3 years earlier, then the numbers you add up are the 3 years at the back end of the process, and it's quite transformational. And I think you can see the pace at which the breakthrough designation has been seized in North America, because companies realize that actually it gets them into the marketplace faster. So David had trailed the idea of early access adaptive licensing in his report, and I think one of the things that the new review needs to think about is what's the functionality of that, and how does it work? I also think that there's another piece to this, which also bears on the cost issue, which ultimately bears on the remuneration issue. And there will be clinical trial advocates out there who will probably hate me for this, but the reality is the classical large-scale phase 3 randomized blah blah thing has become increasingly clumsy, increasingly expensive, and delivers actually only a fraction of the information you really want to know when you're regulating a drug. And I think one of the interesting things is to just watch what's going on at the FDA at the moment. Everyone will know that Peggy Hamburg has announced her retirement. What fewer people probably know is that Rob Califf has just been appointed deputy commissioner. And what that means for the succession of Peggy, I don't know, but one might speculate. But Rob, of course, is a huge advocate of cutting out the crap in late-stage phase 3 trials. He's a real one, believing you can do it much cheaper, much faster, and much more efficiently. So, one of the questions is, are we in this game or not? Are we thinking about what would be appropriate data for regulators? How do we make it happen? How do we move it on faster? And interestingly, if the FDA move alongside us, then it makes it a lot easier, because of course one of the criticisms you get when you say it is people say, oh, well, the FDA won't accept it, so we're going back to plan A. Well, actually, I think that may not be the case that much longer. So let's think of lots of dynamic ways to change those coefficients in the formula.
A key issue underpinning that is the relative value of the conventional trials data versus the new observational data, and that's something that the Academy is certainly committed to explore. Let's open this up, because we've not got the Minister for that much longer, and I'm keen that the audience engage, the forum engage. Comments or questions for the panel, please. Is a microphone just coming?
Thank you. Leslie Galloway from EMIG. If we are to improve the way we assess medicines, and if companies are to improve the data they present, aren't we ultimately, and I'm not talking about individual levels of reimbursement, aren't we going to be spending more money on medicines, and don't we therefore need a larger budget?
Yes, Karen Steele from King's College London. I was very interested in your line from the pharmaceutical industry through to the patient, but you didn't mention fundamental basic research in that line. And I know you mentioned once or twice later, like the LMB. But do you see fundamental basic academic research as being an essential part of this whole equation? Because you didn't focus on that. Maybe that wasn't what you were asked to do. But.
Okay. Take one more. Please, Hakim.
Hakim Yadi from the Northern Health Science Alliance. My question is around the engagement of the citizen and whose responsibility it is to get that engagement. We've seen Professor Brian Fox explain quantum physics to the public. I haven't seen that in genomics or electronic medical records, and what decisions should be made with broadcasters, with media, that we should be doing this in a more joined-up way, and whether it's our responsibility as a community or if it lies with others.
Okay, let's get some responses. Minister, do you want to?
I'll be very quick. I'll take them in reverse. I think it's all of our responsibilities. I think you're right. It's a really good point. I think the patients are the best advocates of this, and I'm really keen to make sure that patients who've seen the power of data and genomics speak, because their voice is very powerful, clinicians' voice is very powerful, the charity's voice is powerful. If we want to win this, we all have to speak up and make those benefits clear. And I think I touched on the danger of leaving patients behind. Karen, to fundamental science, absolutely. I was really asked to address particularly the NHS issue today, and I didn't. Please don't misinterpret my comments for a moment. That this whole innovation ecosystem is based on those stunning breakthroughs in both deep biological science, but also the other technologies in informatics, in imaging, and so our support at BIS for deep science budget, for the catapults, for the research councils, which I hope people have seen in a very, very difficult public funding round. The Chancellor and the government have really tried to protect that. That is absolutely key. Without that, I think then we just have a health system. But the extraordinary advantage we have is that the science connected to a health system. That's where I think the academic health science centres really shone the light on what could be possible. And to Leslie, your question about more money. Do I envisage us as a society spending less on medicines? No, not at all. I mean, we're going to get wealthier and we're going to get older. We're going to spend more. But does that mean that there is no scope for spending the current budget better, smarter? No, it doesn't mean that. I think if we actually started to measure what we prescribe and compliance and waste and how many pills get flushed down the loo, and we started to look at which patients respond well, and we started to target better, and we started to... I think there's a huge amount of waste in the system at the moment that we could unlock and reapply. And also I think if we take time, risk and cost out of the development cycle, we unlock value, that word again, which we can recycle into new products. It creates a huge opportunity. How we choose to use that value in partnership with companies is a conversation we need to have. First of all, we've got to deliver the value. We haven't got a conversation unless we deliver it. But I'm really confident that the combination of spending more, spending smarter, and unlocking value together can get us out of jail.
John.
Yeah, just to comment on that, on the last point. I think a lot of this is about not spending less on therapeutics, but thinking about how to be smarter about how we spend the money. And I think, the reality is we all know that many of our medicines are effective in only a small percentage of people who get them, so how do we do that better? Hence the focus on precision medicine. The compliance thing is really relevant. Half the medicines in this country go down the toilet. They don't go into patients. And how do you deal with those sort of issues? And how do you rather more consistently produce drugs that, we really want in the healthcare system? So one of the real paradoxes about the current system is that there's never a conversation at the beginning with the healthcare people saying, actually, I wish you could do A, B, and C. Because if you did, it would be really interesting, even if it's 10 years down the line. I mean, it is very kind of weird, because then what happens, people, they invent things and they say, well, why don't you buy this? And the healthcare system says, well, actually, we don't really want one of those. We want something else. So, this applies to devices, diagnostics, and therapeutics. So I think there's a lot of stuff that could just be finessed in that. And if you take the money we're currently spending and top it up, perhaps with a bit more, you're going to get much more output, much better outcomes. And there's another piece to this which I just add, and that is that, people go, oh, God, the drug bill, it's all disaster. And that, by the way, the healthcare system doesn't work either. People forget that we've reduced cardiovascular mortality by 50% in 15 years in this country. Age-specific mortality for breast cancer has fallen in half in the same time frame. These are huge achievements, and we don't... the trouble is we tend to beat ourselves up more than I think we should, because these are very major achievements, and they've involved all those things. Novel therapeutics, preventative measures, better radiology, better diagnostics, and better healthcare generally. So, it's quite... I think we've got to stay on the front foot in these arguments, not get beaten up into the corner.
Yeah. I think John, then Chris.
Yeah, just amplifying the couple of things that John said there. And really, if you look at therapeutic devices as well as therapeutic drugs, you expand this to radiotherapy, you look at surgery, you look at the way we treat people. Drugs is only part of that, as we know. And in fact, if you look at the precision medicine initiative now going into a catapult, quite a lot of the stuff in the pipeline that will be eventually coming out as translatable concepts do go to these other areas. They don't just go to drugs. They go across a much broader spectrum than that. And I think that what it does take you to as well is that we are wasting money on treating some folk that we shouldn't be treating with the current technique or maybe any other available technique. And that's the hard choices.
Yeah. Chris?
I just wanted to add a comment to the reimbursement piece, and really, George, you talked about the punch and judy of the political cycle. Well, I hope that as we go through this review, we can avoid the punch and judy of the PPRS cycle, because I think it's really unhelpful. And I think I would say that we have to engage, and global industry has to engage, small and large, in this review, because I think we need to sit down and work out how does industry illustrate value, because I think governments will pay, or systems will pay for that value if the value is well documented and explained. So all of the things that have been talked about, wastage, about targeting medicines more, all of those things need to be picked up. But I think we have to sit down in a true partnership and have that discussion in the coming period, so that we actually get to a sensible answer rather than a niggly negotiation, which, to be frank, will help nobody.
Sir Keith.
I just wanted to make a comment rather than ask a question. Apropos of this business of asking what payers are prepared to pay for in return for a new drug, etc., and tell you an absolutely true story. In the 1980s, I was a consultant to Celtec, and they were presented with the possibility of making a drug that would increase the hemoglobin content of people with chronic renal failure. It's now known as EPO. The commercial department of Celtec in those far-off days decided that since there are only 250,000 people on dialysis worldwide, this wasn't a viable proposition, and Celtec didn't do it. And as you know, the rest is history.
Wow. But Keith, and I think I can confidently say this with the members of the pharmaceutical industry in the room, but if you want an opinion about anything about the pharmaceutical industry, you do not ask the commercial directors. They haven't got a bloody clue.
Most payers don't want a drug to cure hepatitis C at $1,000 a time for 90 days.
Yeah.
And amazingly, the astonishing thing that eculizumab, anti-C5, for the treatment of calcium nocturnal hematuria, costs an obscene $400,000 a year to keep patients. And amazingly, NICE have approved it, actually inheritance.
Moving rapidly on to John.
Yeah, maybe just building on that for a second, Keith. I mean, the final point was, how do you break down barriers? How do you break down the silos? What could be the role of patients and others in breaking down those silos? Because I think we're still, you mentioned an Aaron Bevan, I think we're probably, a patient's experience of the healthcare system isn't significantly different, in my opinion, than it was in 1948. I mean, you go through a series of silos. And I think that actually industry also needs to play a role in that. So great example about a pharmaceutical company focused on one area and not being able to see anything else. Better examples in devices, diagnostics, imaging, generally, where the companies have to have a much broader view of the delivery of healthcare, not narrowly focus on their silo, because that's purely reinforcing the concept of deep focus in one area and ignoring the patient as they pass through.
Good. Peter Johnson and then Colin Dollery. Let's take these two together.
Thanks very much. Peter Johnson from Cancer Research UK. I wanted to return to the question of underpinning technologies and how we persuade the healthcare system that it needs to invest in such things as molecular diagnostics, which are the enabling technologies of the precision medicine that we've spoken about, because it's not in their immediate short-term interest to do so. It's a significant cost to the organisation before you realise the benefits. And furthermore, can we identify the hurdles to adaptive licensing, which you've highlighted very well? And we obviously, as everyone knows, have an acute problem in the funding of cancer medicines and the separation of the Cancer Drugs Fund and the NICE process. And how can we actually make progress in overcoming this barrier which we've been dealing with for the past decade?
Colin?
Well, rather like Keith, I'd like to make a comment, because I think the world is about to change radically for medicine. We thought everything had been done when the genome was sequenced and it was published in, 2002. But in fact, it told us much less than we thought, which we didn't know how the protein coding genome was controlled. Now we are beginning to know that. My friend John Stamatoyanopoulos in Seattle described it as the second genome. And this is the genome that controls all these genes, how cells grow, how they heal, how they become disordered and diseased. So I think we're in the verge of a tremendous opportunity. And one of the advantages is some bit of that mechanism is actually controllable with rather simple enzyme inhibitors.
Interesting. Comments from the panel?
Well, I don't think we're going to sit up here and say we've got the answer to the Cancer Drugs Fund problem, Peter, if that's what you're asking. But it does need to be part of the discussion, doesn't it? Because it is a definite outlier in the way we operate. And I think some of the ideas that we've already discussed about how you potentially partner with companies to actually ensure that their drugs are properly evaluated might be one way in which to reduce the burden of that financially on the health system. So I think there does need to be serious thought about how we deal with that, but I'm assuming George's review is going to tackle some of those issues.
What about the motivating the health system to adopt the molecular diagnostic techniques? Because increasingly we're seeing the NHS outsource or centralise its pathology services rather than creating that precision capacity.
Well, I think that the benefits of that are much more short-term, much more in the immediate future than perhaps you suggest. I think 10 years ago, you're right, I think people would have said, well, why would we do that? But I think these days, there are opportunities to use molecular tools diagnostically to start to identify patient populations more precisely. Let me give you an example, and that is I saw an investigator from Imperial this week who's very interested in the hepatitis C problem and the kind of financial issues that Keith alluded to. So 11.9 billion will cure everybody with hepatitis C in the country, but it's 11.9 billion. But the reality is that those drugs work. The course of drugs which is approved, of course, is a course of drugs which was approved because they chose a number. The reality is you can get full remissions with shorter time frames in some patients, and that's driven by the genotype of the drug, by the genotype of the virus plus the viral load. It's really easy to do the study that says treat them for 3 weeks or treat them for 4 weeks, and at that price you save a ton of money. But you won't be able to do that without molecular diagnostics sitting in the background. So I think the yield from having really good molecular tools will appear very, very quickly if we can get it in place. But as you know, Peter, I'm a huge advocate for that piece of the puzzle.
I'm aware that the Minister will need to leave shortly. George, was there anything finally you wanted to say? Or?
Well, I don't want to be accused of ducking any questions, so let me just try and... I think the CDF point is... well made, that I think we can be quite proud of what the CDF has done in its first incarnation. I think the question is where cancer leads, other therapeutic areas are following. The pressure on the Cancer Drugs Fund has come from some underlying breakthroughs on the sort of issues we've been talking about, and I would foresee they're going to grow across other therapeutic areas as well. And I think the issue is where we're going to be interested in looking at drugs that are out with the nice guidance. Now that may be because they're not yet gone through it, or because they, on standard health economic metrics, don't fit it. Then I think we need to think about what is our framework for testing, procuring, adopting innovative medicines in this kind of research medicine translational situation. I think there's quite an interesting way of dealing with what might seem like the intellectual inconsistencies of the CDF in a way that would suddenly make it all seem a lot more sensible. In the context of innovative medicines, innovative adoption, and innovative reimbursement. The supportive technologies point is really well made. I'm very struck. I used to go around hospitals a lot and still do. Why is the pathology always in the basement?
Because it's alongside radiology.
Yeah. I was very. I went to Belfast last week, and the pathology work there is really, really important. The tissue, the data, the informatics. It's that. I think 21st century, that pathology will become very, very much more important in linking to diagnosis and precision medicine and all that. And I think the precision medicine catapult work should well catalyse a lot of that. And adaptive licensing, absolutely. Part of the review is to see whether we could build what I call the lit runway, which would lead you through into adaptive licensing and conditional approval. I want Britain, UK, to be the best place to access the European market. You'd land your plane here and then taxi through into Europe. I want this to be the arrival and departure lounge for 21st century medicine. There you go. There's a aeronautic metaphor. I think the last point on the second genome is brilliantly made. It's way beyond my scientific and intellectual reach, other than to say this. It's a challenge for us in government not to get into silos. We've got to fund the technologies for tomorrow and keep revising and making sure we don't make a huge commitment to fund something that seemed really modern at the beginning of the Parliament, and by the end of it is already out of date. So we've got to keep footloose in government, and I think there's a challenge for everyone else as well in the room. Lobbyists for money, but don't go native on the bid, because we have to keep looking at the convergence, the new models, and make sure that we're doing what no one else can do, which is investing your scarce money that we've taxed off you to invest in public goods, that we're investing it in the things that really require and need our support. And that, in this landscape, that changes pretty fast.
George, thank you very much indeed for a splendid forum lecture, for outlining the challenges of reforming the innovation pipeline so clearly. We wish you all luck with the review of this community, and the Academy in particular will be very pleased to help support that endeavour. Thank you very much indeed. Well, our panel are still here, so please be free to ask further questions. Yes, please.
It's a question for the President and the panel in their capacity as champions of the life sciences. Following what the Mayor's been doing at the moment in the States about promoting, I know it's one particular part of the country, but promoting science, in terms of your role as champions, what is it about the UK at the moment you will be telling inward investors why they should come to the UK as opposed to investing in other countries which are also trying to improve their science base at the moment?
Well, I had the privilege of being with the Mayor in Boston and New York, and I could recount some of the arguments he used, such as the alpine quality of the air in London and the fact that we were the biggest French city outside of France with a 400,000 French population and more Michelin star restaurants than Paris, until they adopted North Korean tactics and spattered the Michelin stars around Paris. But seriously, I think the arguments that had a great deal of impact there were about actually the interdependency and maturity of our ecosystem here. So actually the last point, or the last challenge that the Minister alluded to, not working in silos, I think we have a very productive interdependent ecosystem, if only we can fully leverage the NHS part of it. But over to colleagues.
I would just, number one, the UK is a tiny island. We have to work as a cluster. We must stop this, it's going there, it's going here. What about Oxford, what about Glasgow? I went to Edinburgh, you looked at the Regenerative Medicine Centre, the liver programme, it's unbelievable. The biggest phase 3 study in the world completed recruitment in one city in Salford. So we need to start thinking about ourselves as a big cluster, because that is very attractive if you're coming from Japan or China or the States. They don't see the difference. Number two is the ecosystem. We absolutely have. When I was asked to play this role with the Labour government and then with this government, the thing that absolutely struck me was whether I approached people in NHS, whether I approached academics or folk in business, everybody opened their doors and said, how can we help? And I think that's a really unique feature of this country. So we absolutely have to play the card of the ecosystem. Is everything perfect? No. You heard George talk about, or the Minister, beg your pardon, talk about the issues in the NHS and adoption. We know not everything's perfect, but I think a lot of people do look at the country and go, wow, it's impressive that you at least talk to each other and you're trying to grapple with some of those problems. So those would be some of the things I would promote.
Well, the industrialists I talk to in the sectors I'm familiar with don't need to be convinced about the basic science expertise in medicine and in some of the basic physical sciences either. So they already have that knowledge and have a prejudice that's favourable towards the United Kingdom. Their problem has typically been, I think, that successive governments have suggested that the UK is open for business, whatever that means, and encourage them on an inward investment basis or to partner with a National Health Service. And most of the time, those experiences have not been very fruitful for the other partner. So I don't think it's been a problem of convincing people to come to the UK, because the ecosystem in theory exists, but in practice it doesn't exist to the extent it needs to bring them here and have them stick here.
Yep. The other thing which we mustn't forget is that, and I think the recent REF results reveal this without any ambiguity, is we do have the strongest university system in the world, I think, given the per capita size of the country and the per capita productivity. And that is something which we must be careful not to take for granted. So, it's there because most of the research activity in this country is funneled through universities, public sector research activities. We've grown some terrific and highly competitive institutions. And it is, in my view, the biggest differentiator between the UK science base and that you find in France and Germany and most of the other continental entities. And we must be really careful about that.
Please, other question there.
David Fox, Royal Society of Chemistry. Just building on this point about breaking down silos, which is as important at the invention stage as it is in the pull-through stage. And the whole life sciences strategy is predicated on this ecosystem across academia, industry, CROs, and the rest of it to deliver that invention and ultimately the pull-through. So with that backdrop, I'm just refer to the Wellcome Trust report that came out very recently about the UK's innovation ecosystem, which I think, if you haven't read it, is an excellent 4-page report that shines a light on some of the gaps. We are strong in certain areas, but I think there are some great gaps that have been identified here. One of which is that we're in an environment where the academic culture doesn't facilitate translation. That's the evidence that they've generated as part of their research. It's we have to look at what we've been talking about within the context of reviews such as that.
Comments?
Well, speaking with somebody who's got an association with a Ruscrook University, I would say that there's a pretty high degree of commitment to translation and a growing interest in cross-disciplinary activities as well. If you look at the future of, even the short-term future of the development of medical products outside pure therapeutic pharmaceuticals, they're all combinatorial products, in fact, and indeed drugs and devices are now being combined. Drugs and diagnostics are being combined. Interoperative diagnostics are a new feature. That requires not only a translation across disciplines, but actually fundamental research across disciplines as well. I don't, certainly from my own experience, I don't have the sense that there's a lack of understanding of the need for it. But I think some of the structures, particularly university, school, college structures and funding of individual projects and at the level of that sort of granularity is a problem.
Yeah.
So creating cross-departmental and interdisciplinary research institutes, for example, to me is one way to overcome that, and there are some worked examples of that now. And maybe public funders should be more joined up, I hesitate to say, between the different aspects of medical and physical sciences.
But we do, I would agree, we do have, I haven't read the report, but we have a problem with translation, and I don't just think that means in terms of translating basic discoveries through to some sort of product or service. I also think we don't grow the companies here. We should be throwing lots of seeds and growing them, because that's going to be the future. Manny's here from AstraZeneca. ICI started with the 50s with a program out of the chemical industry and grew a massive company, which became AstraZeneca. So we need a few more of those, and I think translation is one of our weak points, in all honesty.
Yeah. When I look at the outputs of the biomedical research centres filling that critical gap, proof of concept, experimental medicine, is formidable. The stuff that's now beginning to come through after the second wave of investment. I still think there are clearly academia is trying to forge mutually beneficial productive relationships with industry That's a new beginning, as it were, for the pharmaceutical industry. But again, I think they're more than green shoots. I've seen a burgeoning of activity in that space over the last 2 to 3 years.
But can I just come in on that? So it's very important. So it's true that in the physical sciences, the engineers have always been the bottom of the totem pole for a whole variety of reasons, which we won't go into. But anyway, so there has been a certain snootiness about translational physical science for a long time. But you have to remember that in medical sciences, there was a terrific community of strong translational science that existed in the 60s and the 70s that essentially entirely vaporized. So in 2005, 2006, about the time that David wrote his report, there was no money for translational science. There was essentially no money. The MRC didn't spend any money on translational science. In fact, they didn't want to spend money on translational science. The Wellcome Trust didn't spend any money on
the famous lozenge of declining
exactly.
commitment.
And that was the bit. So it's less than 10 years since there was new money in the system, and I would agree it's not terrific, but it's a lot better than it used to be. And no one can complain that they don't have the facilities to do it now. And a lot of the bright young folk are going into that space, which I think is terrific, actually.
Indeed.
So.
I just want to agree that I think translational science and collaboration between the private sector and the public sector is growing significantly and has been in some ways as good as it ever has been.
Indeed.
But I think our problem is less about translational science and more about retention. If you look at the amount of medical innovation and scientific innovation, basic research that's happening in the UK, the level of innovation and the impact of that science relative to other countries in the world, we're only really second to the US. But where we lag behind is investing behind that innovation, and in particular funding and driving the delivery of new SME, startups, spin-outs that create the future ecosystem and the future small and mid-sized companies. And so my question to the panel is what do we do to really help drive some of that retention of innovation so it doesn't all end up in the US or in China or in other parts of the world? Because that, I think, is one of the big gaps we have in the UK today.
Indeed. Chris?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, and most of you will know the story. Monoclonal antibodies, Cambridge, developed and bought in the States. AstraZeneca had to pay $16 billion to get them back. It's not a great story. It's a great story now. But I think, number one, in terms of what do we have to do, number one, we have to be more courageous. It's easy to say and hard to do. Number two, we have to get the funding, the money, not from governments, but we have to attract investment capital. The US is very good at this. The UK is quite good at it, but we don't do it enough. But if we can put those two things together, the courage and the investment capital, then we have to accept that we're going to see all these small things happening, and we've got to back some of them. And we've got to also, the Treasury need to do things such that in the end, people don't want to do their IPO in the States and take the tax advantages. They want to do it here in the UK. Easy for me to say those things. I know they're not problems that are easy to solve, but we've really got to do that if in the long term we want to create wealth for the country.
Indeed.
There's a huge deficiency in long-term patient capital. So the venture thing's been fun. We've been doing it for 35 years. Haven't created one mid-sized company. Don't spread this around, but it's a minor catastrophe. Actually, it's a bloody disaster. And anybody who looked at it critically would say, "Why don't you all stop now? Because you're not generating any economic growth of value." So it's a really serious issue about how we get more patient capital into play. Now, on the continent, it's done with families or foundations. In America, it's done by very deep-pocketed venture capitalists who've got unlimited funds and who play it out a long time. And we don't have either one of those things. And I know it's something that George is thinking about pretty hard, because without that, I suspect this whole thing is not going to do what everybody says it's going to do.
I'd link these two things together because actually there is a very good worked example going right back to the Life Science Strategy 2011 to today of joined up committed government funding from basic science all the way through translation to economic development and networks to test out in real clinical practice. And that's the Stratified Precision Medicine Initiative, which is now coming to the point where we're starting to see genuine outputs from that. There will be coming to a store near you soon. The point about that is that if we don't solve this problem, and so I'm just building on the problem rather than the solution, we're going to see yet another tranche of exit for intellectual property, and we'll be clipping the coupons very nicely as monoclonal antibodies, MRCT, have been clipping the coupons for that for some considerable time together with MRC. So we have made money out of it, but it's not been the sort of building of an industrial base. But this is a worked example where if we don't get it right, there's every reason to say we are simply clipping the coupons and looking for the future from royalty income, not building businesses.
Thank you for that, Benny. I'm going to invite Sir David Cooksey, whose review has been referenced at least on 2 or 3 occasions, who triggered thoughts about the need to accelerate this innovation process. David.
Thank you, John. There are 2 or 3 points that I'd like to make. One is that undoubtedly a lot of the problem with cost is the lost time that there is between the original discovery and actually getting the thing through the pipeline. And I think university technology transfer offices are a lot to blame for this, because they take a long time to find the place where the technology is going to land and then argue about how much they're going to get for it for ages. I think there are problems when you get into the clinic with very slow accretion of panels for clinical trials and so on, and that is a real problem. I agree with John about the problem of venture capital. None of the venture capital funds that have been set up in this country or in Europe have had enough firepower to live through the timescales that we're talking about. And virtually all venture capitalists have lost their shirts on this, and their investors' shirts. So it is a disaster from John's point of view. I would like, however, to point to what the Wellcome Trust is trying to do now with Syncona, which is to have a really large fund and to allocate probably 30 to 50 million pounds to each project, so that they can take it through to that point where the real value is being demonstrated. Because what's gone wrong every time is that we don't develop the value before we run out of money, and that's been the problem.
Yeah. Right. Thank you very much. I see the panel nodding. Any further comments? I think it summarises the situation very well. Please. You shouldn't have said you didn't need a microphone. Now here it comes back.
Thank you. Yeah. So I want to ask about the role of the market in this whole scheme, because at one end you have academic scientists, which are publicly funded mostly, and then you have the market system, private industry in the middle, and then you have the public funding again at the end, who are the consumers, the patients, and the National Health Service. Have we got the boundaries right between these different these different modes of operation? Because it does seem that for some particular diseases, it's always going to be difficult for the market to actually win and persuade industry to invest money in some of the more difficult diseases. And so I'm just wondering whether there's a place for developing different ways of operating at those boundaries.
I think there's a super example, antibiotics. Industry, I worked in my career in industry well over 30 years, and you get to a point where, so we've developed this medicine, it works, okay, we'll put it on the shelf, because that's where it's safest to put it, so that when we run out of antibiotics, we'll use that one. My patent runs out, so the model doesn't work. And I think there has been, Dame Sally has, I think, led an initiative to try and stimulate, to be the catalyst. I think it's a good example of the UK can't solve this problem. What we can do is we can be a catalyst to solve the problem and say to industry globally, this just isn't going to work. So we need to come up with a new model. And your question around the boundaries is a very good one, because I think the model that is in place now and has been in place for decades just doesn't work to solve that particular problem. I think we'll see more. Can you imagine the pharmaceutical company that finds the pill that solves the disease and you take one of them? And when someone talks about the cost of that, I can imagine there's going to be a massive argument, but it will happen. And so I think there has to be a mature conversation with global industry about exactly that point. Antibiotics is a good one to start with, because it is a conundrum, in my opinion. I think Dame Sally has showed a great leadership in trying to get that conversation going.
There are other boundaries as well which go the other way, interesting enough, because if you invest in a diagnostic of some sort in the United Kingdom, and you want to take it to market, you may find yourself in competition with homebrew diagnostics in the hospital service that are not constrained by the same restrictions from a regulatory point of view, and where the economics are hidden because it's part of a pathology service. So yeah, I agree. There are boundaries which can be a serious impediment to seeing things come through all the way to patient application. But there are some curious anomalies in that which need to be addressed as well.
Any final questions? Yes, please, Jeremy.
Jeremy Haig from Amgen. Bearing in mind the hiatus after the last change of administration, I'm interested to know whether the panel members believe that the foundations and underpinnings of the current Office of Life Sciences are strong enough to withstand a change of administration in May.
John,
Chris,
can I play that back to you and say that if you all believe that where we've got to in terms of ministerial and civil service appointments is a good place, then the only way that the administration that comes into power will recognise that if you tell them that. So I can't predict what will happen. I don't think anyone can. But if we think we're in a good place in terms of what's been put in place, I would really ask people to make sure their voices are heard. If you don't think we're in a good place, fine, but I don't think it was possible to predict. And you were right, last time round we lost a year.
Yeah. I thought we were in a good place last time.
Yeah, but I appreciate that it did take a while to get traction. But the reality is this concept of the OLS was Paul Drayson's concept. He was a Labour minister. And it took this government a bit of time to realize it was probably a good thing. But in the end, I think they've taken it further to everybody's advantage. And when George went around to get cross-party support for his review, which I think is a pretty central thing for what he's going to do now, he's obtained cross-party support. Everybody said, look, no matter who's running this place, they're going to have to fix this problem because it's a real issue. So I mean, who knows, because you don't know who's going to be sitting in the seat, but the initial signs are that there's going to be support whoever is sitting in, except I can't speak for the SNP or UKIP. Okay. I wouldn't know about that.
I can speak for the Welsh Nationalists if you'd like me to, but I'll have to do it in Welsh. But I think it's an important point. There's likely to be, as George said himself, maybe a coalition after the next election. I think part of the momentum that was lost is that people had other issues to resolve, and there could very well be a similar situation this time. But everything, I mean, all the stuff we talked about is fundamental, really. Yeah. Economically fundamental, from a health point of view fundamental, and the solutions that I think have been come up with by now 2 successive governments are good ones. And I echo what Chris says. I think if the community in its more general sense is prepared to speak up for it, there'll be people that will be prepared to listen.
So perhaps to finish, invite each of the panel members to describe what their hopes for the review might be, where they think we should aspire to get to.
Right, okay, well, I first of all, I think it's really important for the review to take into consideration this question of the, as it were, the social contract. Where do we operate from? How to, in the context of patients and society? I think that's crucial. But I also think that improving and making more efficient the whole process of drug, device, and diagnostic discovery and adoption must be central to this, because it is, in essence, a key element if we're going to make the health service more efficient. But it's also a key element if we're going to drive the economic agenda.
Thank you. Chris?
I hope the review manages to pull together the different strands that have been mentioned. I won't reprise them again, but I really hope that if we come out of this, we've actually not left a piece of it undone, because I think that would be a real shame.
And I would say I don't think anybody would expect a magic bullet to be the output of this. A couple of things I would say. One is that I hope it keeps the individual, the patient's family central to this whole question as a driver for adoption, as well as the service, because I think that is fundamental. And I hope it addresses the issues of silos, through the whole of the healthcare chain.
Well, I hope that philosophy of interdependency and joint working describes the forum as well. Just say in closing that those of you that are members of the forum, if you want to know how to join the forum, then the leaflet about the forum explains that. Can I finish by thanking very sincerely our 3 life sciences champions and of course you, the audience, for a stimulating set of questions.